Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and welcome to our 2018 Senate election updates. Today, as you can see, we have a ton of states that actually have new polling or information that I want to talk about. Won't necessarily change the prediction, I just feel it's worthy of talking about. But before we do that, I want to jump in and talk about the new stuff about Kavanaugh. The allegations, I don't think anybody should be jumping to conclusions on this, whether you want to believe the accuser or Kavanaugh. Kavanaugh should be treated as innocent until proven guilty, and the accuser should at least be allowed to testify before Congress. The way I think this is going to work is eventually they're going to look at it and say, okay, we have to do this before we allow it to go forth. Let's do this quickly and efficiently. Let's not drag it out. And unfortunately, for those who maybe want something substantive, I'm willing to bet this is going to wind up being her word against Kavanaugh's word. And in that case, you have to default to we can't prove that he's guilty, so we'll use the term not guilty because innocent implies that he's 100% didn't do it. Again, it's going to be his word versus her word. I literally do not think there's going to be any actual physical evidence either way, which I don't think that's going to deter any of the Republicans. Yeah, there will always be that doubt, but you can't prove it one way or the other. But that would allow someone to, say, a Joe Donnelly or a Joe Manchin or a Heidi Heitkamp the ability to vote against confirming Kavanaugh, and it would allow, say, Susanna Collins or Lisa Murkowski to vote no without upsetting the base. They could say, you can't have a Supreme Court justice with that type of legal scandal. So it may give them an out. Anyway, now on to the polls. The first one we're going to talk about is Arizona, where Kyrsten Sinema has kind of maintained her lead, other than two polls from early this month showing movement towards Martha McSally. Fox News, which is a fairly good pollster. I know it's not actually Fox News. They're just the ones who commissioned it. I forget who the company they use is, but the company they use is very reputable. It's got an A rating on 538, and I looked at it. They do their methodology right. There are a few things I want to nitpick about it, but it's not really worth it, in my opinion, once you reach the A ratings. And they show Kyrsten Sinema up by 4% among registered voters and 3% among likely voters, with a decent sample size and a low amount of undecideds. I'm willing to, I'm not going to move it, but I think it's reasonable to say that Kyrsten Sinema is maintaining some form of an advantage in her Senate race. So I'm going to keep it as tilts Democrat, but chances are we could see that move to a lean in the not too distant future. So let's look at Florida, where we've had two polls come out that I haven't had a chance to look at. This Survey USA poll and this It's Rasmussen. So there is a slight house effect with Rasmussen. Not a significant one, as some people would say, but there is a house effect. This race is definitely toss-up, and because of that, I'm not going to move it from tilt Republican, even though I consider this race true toss-up, where I don't want to call either side. I want to see Bill Nelson have a solid. I want to see him, do this kind of thing. I want to see him ahead in a majority of recent polls before I can, and by recent I mean since July, or let's move it up and say a majority since the start of August, before I consider flipping it to him having an advantage. That said, this race, along with the next race in Indiana, I won't be too critical of anyone who puts the Democrats in an advantage. I tend to lag. I'm not aggressive when it comes to new polling information. I don't want to be the person who overreacts to polls, because I don't think that's the correct way to narrate political races, and it doesn't take into account the fact that the politics is much more nuanced than the media likes to portray. So anyway, in Indiana, we have another Fox News poll indicating that Mike Braun, at least among the likely voters, is ahead by 2, but amongst registered voters, Joe Donnelly is ahead by 1. It's a little weird. You look at the Marist College poll that we looked at last week, it definitely shows Joe Donnelly with the lead. I was having this as a leans Mike Braun race, but now I put it in tilts. I'm still going to keep it in tilt for right now, simply because I want to see Joe Donnelly get more of a polling advantage. And we have to remember, this all from one pollster, and I don't really factor in partisan polls, even if they show the opposite direction than what you would think they should. Plus, if you look at Marist, you see massive shift towards the Republican when you switch to likely voters, and when you factor in a third-party candidate, which is really strange, but whatever. It doesn't make sense to me, but so I'm going to keep it as tilts for now, but again, if you have this as tilt or lean Dem, same thing with Florida, I can't argue with that, because that could be the way you see the race. By that same token, Josh Hawley has made some ground up in terms of polling against Claire McCaskill, including a lot of polls showing a dead heat between the two. I'm still going to keep this as tilt towards McCaskill, though Hawley definitely has the ability to win this race. Before I change it from advantage Claire McCaskill to anything else, I want to see Hawley with a more consistent. I want to see him in some recent polls with an actual lead, and I want to see him have probably a majority of polls that show him in the lead. Right now, if we go everything post-July, aka since August 1st, Hawley needs to get an advantage in one more poll to make it dead even, and 2 in order to take an advantage. Where I would consider, not necessarily do, change. If we look in Nevada, we've got 2 polls that I haven't seen, or that are newer, from Suffolk University and from Gravis. Both are fairly reputable pollsters. I've looked at their polls before, if I remember correctly, on camera. We've got Dean Heller behind in both by 1% according to Suffolk, and both in the low 40s there. And Gravis shows it in the mid to high 40s, and him behind by 2. Honestly, I'm going to keep this as tilt Democrat. Dean Heller is definitely overperforming my personal expectations of him in terms of this race, but Kyrsten Sinema does have Kyrsten Sinema's in Arizona. Sorry, Jackie Rosen has the advantage here, but it is a true toss-up race, hence why I'm tilting it, not leaning it. We go to New Mexico, where a new poll shows Martin Heinrich up by a healthy margin against Mark Rich and Gary Johnson in the mid-teens. This race would actually be competitive if Gary Johnson wasn't competing for more conservative votes against Mark Rich. You see him in the mid-teens to mid-20s, obviously, though the only 2 nonpartisan pollsters have him hovering in the upper teens if you average them out. The way I see this race, it's still safe, but if it weren't for Gary Johnson, this race would actually be competitive and worth talking about. But I really just, I don't know. If either Mark Rich or Gary Johnson were to drop out or endorse the other, maybe this race would be something to talk about. Because we should all realize that Gary Johnson, for the most part, would caucus with the Republicans. So Mark Rich could safely say, okay, I am dropping off the ballot. If you are a Republican, please vote for Gary Johnson. If you don't like Martin Heinrich, vote for Gary Johnson. If you're a moderate Democrat or a Democrat who doesn't like Heinrich, vote for Gary Johnson. He may not give you everything you want, but he will vote with the Democrats on some issues. He's not a Republican. He's kind of his own thing. You know, if it were Gary Johnson, I actually think he would be not only very competitive, but maybe even beating Heinrich, because he doesn't have the Republican baggage that, say, Mark Rich would. Gary Johnson is essentially where a Republican could run if they weren't attached to Trump. But as it stands, that's not the way the race is breaking out and unfolding, so we're going to give it to Heinrich as safe, which, again, that's not a change. I just thought it was something interesting to talk about. Poll in North Dakota, the first really new one in a long time, has Kevin Cramer up by a healthy amount, which is what I expected. And as such, I'm going to keep it as leans towards Kevin Cramer. He's actually running a competitive race. We go to Tennessee, and recent polls have Marsha Blackburn up, though, as we all know, Phil Bredesen is definitely competitive in the state. I haven't seen enough recently, aka post-primary, to consider giving it to him, and Blackburn has kind of solidified GOP support around her. So I'm only going to tilt it towards her because Bredesen is very competitive in the state. And again, if you have this tilted or leaning towards Bredesen, I'm not going to argue because there is very good reason to do that. I'm just explaining the way I see this. I'm factoring the history of the state in, maybe more so than others would. But understand that I recognize that Bredesen has a chance. We'll look at Texas, and Ted Cruz is having a narrow battle. I think a lot of people maybe underestimated Beto O'Rourke. I don't think he's going to win, but he is making this competitive and vulnerable. And at this point, it only takes a small shift or a small miss in polling in order for Beto to actually have this. That said, I can't take it into leans until I see a poll. I can't take it away from leaning towards Ted Cruz. I am actually downgrading this because his lead is not, it's very tentative. But until I see a poll with Beto O'Rourke ahead with a low amount of undecideds and from a reputable pollster, I can't take it out of this category. And even then, I want to see a couple with him ahead or actually tied, ignoring this Texas Lyceum poll from ages ago. Before I put this in the true toss-up category. I think Ted Cruz definitely has the advantage, and enough of one where he is the favorite to win. Plus, again, Texas is a historically red state, at least in recent memory. I think we just need to realize that this might be a bridge too far, but it's showing that Texas may be moving faster than even I thought. Now we go to West Virginia, where I'm actually going to upgrade this to likely for Joe Manchin. I had it as leans for a while because I was seeing some very competitive numbers from Morrissey, but at this point, I've seen enough information now to say that, yeah, Joe Manchin is more than likely going to win this race again, win this seat again, and I really don't see Morrissey being that competitive. Anyway, so as it stands, this is the map that I'm looking at. There's not much changing. Indiana and Florida are really it, and Indiana, Florida, yeah, you can see a slight shift, but that said, here's what you should be looking at. Again, I must stress that these are my confidence levels. Tilt is, I think it's a true toss-up, but I don't like having toss-ups, so I'm going to call the party who I see as having the advantage, both historically and according to polls. I can kind of combine the two. I will look at campaign funds, but I won't factor those in too heavily. Leans is, I'm confident enough to call a winner, but it's an extremely competitive race, and don't be surprised if I'm wrong. Likely, for example, these three states is any state where I'm pretty confident, though if there's a large enough polling error, I could be very wrong in that race. And solid is, don't even joke about it going to the other party, because it's 99% of the time it just won't happen. Though it could shift. We've still got time before Election Day, so it could happen. And also, there was a new poll in Virginia from, I forget who, but it was a more reputable pollster that showed what everybody else had been showing, and that kind of indicated to me that that Seigel or Signal poll was an outlier, so yay, I got that one right. Anyway, thank you all for watching. I hope you have a nice day. I'll see you guys next time. Take it easy. Bye.